interesting people. My paper today is titled Moving Beyond Troubled and Troublesome Youth. I'm going to talk about a young woman that some of you may have heard about. Her name is Amanda Todd. She committed suicide at the age of 15. When she was 12, she was on an online chat room and was talking to what we think was an adult male who pushed her to show her breasts. He later threatened to send that picture around the internet if she didn't reveal more. And he sadly made good on that threat, did spread it around the internet. Amanda was bullied at school based on that image. She moved from school to school. The picture followed her, the bullying followed. And she was dealing with depression, anxiety, and a panic disorder. She created a video to convey her suffering through the use of black lettering on flashcards. And the video went viral after her suicide. Her suicide's been widely covered in Canada and elsewhere. So this is an image of Amanda Todd, and then those are the black and white flashcards that were part of her video. There was, according to the province, one of the papers in BC, her death was, there was a vigil in 40 cities commemorating her death. In December, the Vancouver Sun, which is the paper of record in BC, stated that it was one of the top read stories in 2012 on Google. So my presentation has three parts. First, I'm going to talk about the dominant frames that were used to talk about Amanda Todd's suicide. And then I'm going to talk about the politics of forgetting immediatization. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. I'm going to get into it in a few minutes. And then third, I'm going to talk about engaging a vulnerability framework through a politics of remembering. So data sources. Work in progress. That's the first thing I want to focus on. One of my data sources is interviews with politicians. I used to work in politics in the 90s. I was a senior advisor to the Minister of Education. And I worked in an office that investigated child deaths and care of planning for children in care. And in that time, it became really apparent to me how powerful the media was in framing policy. So, in a minister's office, and I'm betting it's rather similar here, in a minister's office in the morning, the first thing that was looked at was the news clips. And one could have a sense of what kind of day they were going to have based on those news clips. And often, particularly around children's issues, it drove policy. So there was this, fix it. This is horrible. There's parents outraged. Fix it. And I don't look at this just cynically. When I was in the Children's Commission, for example, be reading horrific reports of children's deaths day in, day out. And sometimes there was this like, there's got to be something. There's got to be a solution. And so the media often were like, this is horrible, do something. Policymakers would be responding to that, often in the absence of any kind of research whatsoever. And part of the problem was it was dealt as a single episode rather than looking at any kind of systemic issues. So I'm really interested in looking at the connection between media and policy. The other thing in terms of, and I also interviewed a number of journalists as well. The other thing I looked at was media coverage. So I looked at the Globe and Mail, which is the paper of record in Canada, the national paper. The National, also a national paper. The Vancouver Sun. That's the paper of record in British Columbia, which is the province that Amanda Todd grew up in. And that's where I'm from. And the Toronto Star, which is also a major paper that covered the story very widely. So in looking at frames that I just saw over and over in the coverage, was the troubled and troublesome youth. Now this is the one image I have not of the data sources I listed, it's just CNN. Bullied Canadian teen leaves behind chilling YouTube video. So the story here is about a troubled girl that goes to social media, and I'll get into that in a second. The other frame is the troublesome youth, the predatory youth, the youth that go on social media to to bully and to hurt others. And for some reason, here, I'll go over here. So here's one quote that really struck me. Amanda's tormentors were far worse than mere bullies. We shouldn't trivialize what they did to Amanda by calling them bullies, even if all are adolescents themselves. They need to be named for what they really are: tormentors, torturers, and maybe even murderers. And they need to be brought to account. Amanda's tormentors were worse than mere bullies. So here we have youth as if they're in the Lord of the Flies Islands, where they're horrible. There's no understanding of how could they do it, an assumption that nothing like this ever happens in the adult world, that somehow they commit these horrible acts. So the troublesome youth frame, we know, is not a new one. I mean, there's been research about this over decades, that the youth as the predator. And that's very much connected, in this case, to social media as an actor. So there are headlines like, Amanda Todd suicide, the web has a lot to answer for. So the web becomes this actor, this horrible actor that creates incredible atrocities. And so the quote here is, social media is a tool without any conscience of its own, yet it has become in the hands of juveniles and the embittered a malignancy. But how to reasonably and practically suppress the vomitorium of venom on social media, to recondition teenagers numbed by the splatter of hatefulness. So here I looked at this and I thought, okay, is there any other group where we would assume that they're all the same? Yet it has become in the hands of, pick your group. No, somehow with youth, we can talk about youth as if they're one big group. There's no differences. They're all a bunch of predators. And here is also a very entrenched narrative. So social media is to blame here, and in this case is seen as the problem. But if we look back, whenever a new medium is introduced, whether it's television or radio, there's a panic. There's a panic that we don't have control over what young people are doing. Oh my goodness, they're going to be watching TV, reading magazines that we don't have total control over as adults. And this is going to create, guarantee, moral decay. So that's the narrative. And that's the narrative that we see here as well. Amanda Todd tragedy highlights how social media makes bullying inescapable. So it's not people, it's social media. Somehow social media makes acts of violence inescapable. Another frame throughout was policies to punish. So here we have Liberal MP Marc Garneau, who was the first Canadian astronaut, called on the federal government to tackle the growing problem of online bullying. Social media is a wonderful thing, but it's a terrible beast. And it can really damage people severely and even drive them to suicide. It's about time the government took this seriously, Garneau said as he urged a multi-pronged strategy. The next one was RCMP is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It's a federal police force in Canada. Given more teeth to deal with bullies, Marin, Alberta town. So here, this town in Alberta, which is where I grew up, they created a bylaw to prohibit bullying and to give fines if somebody was caught being a bully. Another one was to blame schools. We have the remedies now, we need action. Bullying can be prevented, but administrations need to change attitudes and take off the kid gloves with dealing with aggressive perpetrators. So here again, children as perpetrators, and also this is going back to narratives of zero tolerance, which we know affect young people of color, affect poor young people much more than other groups, that it becomes a way of pushing those children out of school. Amanda Todd's death leads to an anti-bullying debate in Canada's Parliament. Another theme that was quite dominant is adult media is different. So adult media is super responsible, never does anything, never bullies. We don't have to worry about adult media. Something that I ended up getting involved in was the Globe and Mail's coverage. So the Vancouver School Board came out begging, pleading with the media to not repeat the really very sensational media coverage, because there is really extensive research about sensational media coverage and how that can become a factor in the deaths of young people that are considering suicide, that it can be a factor that can put them over the edge. So there's lots of research about this. It's something I dealt with in the Children's Commission on a very regular basis in the 90s. So I agreed with the Vancouver School Board, and I was quite horrified by a lot of the coverage, particularly how they talked about the bullies. So there was the bullies were not human beings, but horrible perpetrators that should be brought to justice. We don't know anything about these kids. We do know that often kids that bully have been bullied themselves, have been victims of violence. We do know that. But that was never part of the coverage. These children don't have names. They don't have lives. They're just perpetrators. So I was very concerned about the coverage. And so after the Vancouver School Board came out, a reporter from the Globe and Mail emailed me and said, well, we think this stuff about how to cover suicide it's really outdated, and there's really no evidence for it. So I sent him a meta-analysis of over 50 studies done since the 1960s that show overwhelming evidence that sensational coverage can be a factor. He ignored that, and which wasn't a huge surprise. And instead, they wrote an op-ed that said the school board, would muzzle the media with Canadian guidelines that are desperately out of date. Avoid admiration of the deceased, the guidelines say. Avoid photos of the deceased. Avoid the word suicide in the headline. These guidelines would, in effect, shunt suicide to the corner of the cemetery, where they once used to be. Imagine not being able to speak of admiration of Amanda Todd, or any other person, teen or adult, who committed suicide. Now here, the day before this was published, I had sent an op-ed that talked about it's not whether to talk about suicide, but how to talk about suicide. And what about the frames that have been completely left out around sexualization of girls, around what are adult responsibilities to provide resources for young people, that we need to talk about those, and we need to talk about people that have recovered from mental illness, that lead fulfilling lives. We need to talk about suicide prevention. So this was published, and they said they were using guidelines, Associated Press guidelines for the coverage of suicide. So I went and looked at those, and no such guidelines existed. But another set of guidelines existed that the Associated Press had signed on to. And those guidelines were very similar to the psychiatric associations, except they said you could use a picture of the deceased but have information about suicide prevention attached to that. The Globe didn't do that. So I emailed the Globe and said, so, these guidelines don't exist. Are you talking about these ones? And do you actually abide by these guidelines? Because I don't see that you are. So they said they did use those guidelines, and they published my op-ed the next day, but didn't address the fact that they weren't following them. So the reason I tell this story is it's the coverage, despite many attempts by many, we just kept going on the very dominant frames of bad kids that need to be disciplined. But eventually they published a small piece, so a couple people did get in. Okay, so the second part of my paper, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? Oh. Second part of the paper is politics of forgetting and mediatization. So Pierre Bourdieu talks about the politics of historical forgetting. Forgetting as a way to maintain power, and forgetting as a form of violence, of erasing. And so this made me think about Rena Verk, who was a girl in 1997 who was killed by 6 girls and a boy. And she was in foster care, as were the children that killed her. There was calls for more resources for children. There was calls to make sure the kids had the support that they needed. So again, after Amanda Todd's death, there's calls for support. There's no reference to past commitments to support and the reality of massive cutbacks in the last year in terms of support. What there is erased bullying announced by the Premier, which means expect, respect, a safe education. I used to come up with taglines and would have been appalled at that one. But, so there's the picture, and then there's Pink Shirt Day. So there's the Premier with a bunch of ministers having a flash mob event with youth that look very unhappy to be there. But that's the Premier there. And then they come up with a 10-point plan to deal with bullying. And what I find fascinating here is what's absent. What's absent is relationships. So it's all about protocols. It's about having a smartphone app. Here what's interesting is now social media is the solution because it's controlled by adults. So social media will have an app, kids will report, we'll have protocols, we'll have threat assessment materials, we'll have an advisory committee, which doesn't include youth, police, schools, social agencies, and community partners. There's no mention of young people anywhere. And I found this all the more interesting because Pink Shirt Day, which is a really big thing in Canada, was actually started up by two 17-year-old boys. So it was started up to support a 12-year-old that wore a pink shirt to school, was bullied, so these two got a bunch of shirts and got their friends to all wear them. That's how Pink Shirt Day got going. So there's very little reference to the fact that Pink Shirt Day was actually started by young people saying, we need to change this, right? So now it's this adult, completely adult-orientated day with adults organizing flash mobs with sad-looking children. So the other concept I find helpful to look at this is why is the Premier organizing a flash mob with media there and a 10-point plan, is to look at the concept of mediatization. And so Friesen and Huck talk about how media structures our awareness of time, shapes our attention, and through this process becomes the grounds for knowledge and knowing itself. Mediatization provides a conceptual framework for understanding how media shapes and is shaped by other institutions such as government. And why I think this is important is because, particularly with hollowed out newsrooms across North America, journalists often don't have time to do investigative reporting. They go to people that offer them ready-made news, which is government, right? And government relies on media as well in terms of expanding their base and getting reelected. So I think it's really important to look at this concept of mediatization in terms of how we expand the way that government and the state overall thinks about children and youth. So this is a premier. A premier is like the top elected official in a Canadian province. He said to me, he was retired. The retired ones were always quite a bit more fun. Some of my worst days were Mondays, because the MLAs would come back from their constituencies and they would not only perhaps have talked to constituents or receive telephone calls, but they would have had time to go through their local papers. They'd come back, they'd be so concerned and upset and worried, so the media had a direct effect on policy making. This is a quote from former Minister of Education. Bullying was a bit media-driven. I think it was an overblown issue, I have to tell you. I think it exists. This was an interview from a couple years ago, by the way, so it has nothing to do specifically with the Amanda Todd case. I have to tell you, I think it exists and has always existed and is awful. There's no question about it. She swore a lot. But whenever things get calm in the news and need a diversion, educators in society go to bullying. So she talked about it being a great optics issue. So she said, you know, it's a great optics that you got a picture with a bunch of kids and they look happy because you've got an anti-violence initiative. And so, as she put it, it's in some ways, a warm and fuzzy issue. So, I'm actually not cynical, so I want to move on to the hopeful part. And that's engaging a vulnerability policy framework through politics and remembering. So, if we look at some of the things that were forgotten in the coverage, patriarchy, structural injustice, racism, homophobia, barely mentioned. Adult violence towards children. So this is a picture from Toddlers and Tiaras, horrifying show. Beauty pageants with 3- and 4-year-olds that are spray painted, spray tanned, and so I think it's important to remember that when we talk about these horrible things youth do to youth. Well, what about what adults do to kids, including on mainstream television? Youth activism to fight adult violence. So again, looking at all the things that youth do to fight violence. So in terms of space, it's too bad Barbara left. I have a quote here from her. Is part of it is looking at telling the forgotten stories of children's empowerment. Dr. Woodhouse talks about engaging in the method of legal argument called oppositional narratives that was developed by feminists and critical race theorists. And I think that this is something that's really important. She talks about emotive analysis, I'm quoting you, that she calls generism to focus attention on the role of the younger generation. I think part of this is looking at to communication scholars like Angela McRobbie and Thornton who say today most political strategies are media strategies. The contest to determine news agendas is first and last a battle of the political campaign. So there are spaces to reframe troubled and vulnerable youth. There's independent media, there's youth media, there's social media. I do think that corporate media and government still drive a lot of the frames. And so if you look at social media, they often still refer to corporate media. So I think we still have to pay attention to corporate media if we want to try and change government agendas. So developing, engaging a vulnerability framework. So I was looking at this in terms of what we can do as academics, and also looking at it as somebody that has in the past advised government, and some of the challenges. So some of the challenges I think are the sense of time of journalists. Journalists often have a few hours to create a story. Politicians are thinking in terms of an electoral cycle. As academics, we're often thinking about time in very different ways. So I think that to engage policymakers and media to expand frames requires thinking about spaces of opportunity that are based on electoral cycles and based on media cycles. That there's certain times where there's more room maybe to expand frames than other times. I think that the other challenge is that media and policy is so often episodically driven rather than systemically driven. And this is an area where I think there is room to work collectively to write op-eds that reframe things through a vulnerability framework. And you know, when I talk to politicians, it's often op-eds, it's often the media they talk about in terms of things that's changed their minds around policy. So I really do think that that's often an opportunity to have that conversation. Definitions of research are often really different. In terms of definitions, journalists, so the journalist I talked to that said there was no research about suicide prevention, well, there was, but he didn't see it on his first page on his Google search. So, and that's what he told me. So it mustn't be important because it wasn't on the first page. So I think that there are things that academics can and other researchers can do around using strategies that journalists and policymakers use, like audits, for example. And this is what got me really excited about a vulnerability framework, is thinking, okay, how could you use an audit to say, all right, physical resources, social resources. So looking at policy, are policymakers being responsible, or are they bullying young people, right? Are they cutting housing, right? Or are they providing housing? Are they making sure that all children have proper education? Are they cutting education? Social supports. One thing that has come out a lot in work I've done with youth is the need for recreation, the need for, to have contact with adults that's not based on client youth or student youth, but contact that's about being participants in a shared society, a shared space. So I think using audits and stories that engage policymakers and journalists are something that as academics, and in terms of engaging a framework, a vulnerability framework, would be really useful, and that I could see would have been really useful in trying to reframe the story of Amanda Todd. The other thing I've heard in talking to various people about the vulnerability framework is, well, it's nice, but it's the economy. So it's like, yeah, no, it would be great to provide all these resources, but I mean, the economy is really bad right now, right? And so I've been trying to reframe that and saying, okay, the economy is not a neutral thing, but related to values and beliefs, and that it's not necessarily new money, but real reallocation of money, such as not giving such big subsidies to big corporations. And the other thing that I think is really important, and one thing that I've found just in the conversations I've had with students, is is challenging the frame of youth can't make decisions and talking about vulnerability as a way to have an intergenerational conversation that involves young people rather than talking about young people. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Yeah. But,